everyone, I'm Azzy, and today I'm going to be reviewing The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. So I picked up this lovely hardcover from QBD, and I really didn't have any expectations when I started reading this one. So where does it sit on the list for the top 100? This one's a little bit all over the place, but it is on The Guardian's Best 100 Novels Written in English. It's also on Barnes & Noble's 50 Must-Read Books Before You Die, and BBC's 100 Top Novels That Shaped Our World. So this book was actually written in 1963, but our story starts in 1953, with the main narrative taking place between New York and Boston. Our lead character is Esther Greenwood. She's 19 years old, she's incredibly intelligent and incredibly cynical. We find Esther experiencing a real sense of existential dread and heightened anxiety in her life. So without many real spoilers, this book begins with Esther contemplating the upcoming execution by electrocution of the Rosenbergs. Now, the Rosenbergs were real people. They were American citizens that were accused of spying for the Soviet Union, and they were electrocuted to death in Sing Sing prison in 1953. On the first page of this book, we immediately see electrocution being used as a form of punishment, which is really relevant considering how shock treatment was used back in clinics in those days. And okay, I actually just looked this up, and electroshock treatment is still being used today. I mean, I'm presuming it's an awful lot safer nowadays than it used to be, but I'm actually kind of surprised that it is still a treatment. I thought it had gone the way of villains like Nurse Ratched. When I first picked up The Bell Jar, straight away, I felt like I was in the author's mind. This book is written in first-person perspective, and it is dripping with cynicism. And when you start reading it, you feel like the thoughts that are written on paper couldn't just be contrived for the character. You feel like they had to have been real thoughts from a real person. It just feels super authentic. It actually wasn't until after I finished reading this book and looked up Sylvia Plath that I realized that this is semi-autobiographical, and honestly, you can tell. As I read the book, I kind of felt like I was reading a feminist version of Catcher in the Rye. Both Esther and Holden are adolescent characters dealing with this intense sense of alienation and isolation from the world. They're both suffering from feelings of loss, from feelings of failure, and these feelings have negatively impacted the way that they view the rest of the world. But in the imagery and metaphor of the bell jar as this protective dome under which scientific odysseys and delicate, fragile things are kept, we clearly see the idea of the constrictions of women in the 1950s and the weight of expectations that our character Esther was really feeling on her, as well as it being a metaphor for the societal constraints. It's also obviously a metaphor for her mental health, and this image is really meant to show the suffocating reality of Esther's personal mental breakdown. Now, I have to say I was a little bit perturbed by my own ability to totally relate to this character's thoughts. Maybe it's because some of this girl's reality I kind of feel like I've lived. For example, her experiences with academics and with scholarships, her idea of feeling kind of a bit isolated, a bit out of place, this whole imposter syndrome, which you feel like she has. And I've totally experienced that. And these really heightened levels of anxiety, and high anxiety is something I've actually just been diagnosed with. So I actually read this book about a month ago, and I was trying to think of a good example of how I felt so similar to this character in some ways and some of the things that she says or thinks. And the first example I could find was this one. Oh, I can read a bit of French, I guess. And I've always wanted to learn German. I'd been telling people I'd always wanted to learn German for about 5 years. Yeah, I do that all the time. So many people say this is a really bleak read, So I kind of giggled a lot through this book because I just keep seeing these little things about the way that she sees the world and was kind of like, oh yeah, I totally see the same thing. But I don't know, I just kind of found the way that Esther sees the world as funny and natural somehow. In fact, when I was reading this book, I was kind of shocked at the really sudden jump from Esther's normal day-to-day life to clinics and craziness. At one point, I actually jumped back in the book just because I thought that maybe I'd accidentally skipped ahead and like missed a chapter or something, because it felt like such a sudden jump to me. I would actually be really interested to know if anyone who is here having read the book found the jump in story jarring like I did, or if they kind of just felt it like continuous or flowy and really natural, because it really didn't to me. And I'm not sure if that should be worrying. Because she felt normal, right? I really don't know what it says about me that I found her so normal. Anyway, time for some pros and cons. So let's start with the pros. Even though this book is set back in time, it doesn't feel dated. I mean, there's very little in the pages that really give away that 1950s feel. Some of the feminist issues with her feeling controlled, how the book paints a picture of psychiatric care at the time. Obviously, a lot has changed since the 1950s. At least you'd hope a lot's changed since the 1950s. The actual emotional and psychological journey of Esther still feels fresh and modern and relevant. Now, Miss Sylvia Plath, the author, was a poet, and this is super evident in the book. Her prose are beautiful. One of the most significant pieces of imagery in the book is the idea of the fig tree, which is one of the most beautiful ways I've ever seen indecision described. So I was going to read that one. I saw myself sitting in the crotch of this fig tree, starving to death, just because I couldn't make up my mind which of the figs I would choose. I wanted each and every one of them, but choosing one meant losing all the rest, and as I sat there unable to decide, the figs began to wrinkle and go black, and one by one they plopped to the ground at my feet. That isn't a summary of how so many people see their lives. I just don't know what is. So one of the big cons for the book for me was the end. Without saying what the end is, I'm just going to say that I found it really unsatisfying. And you know what? It honestly almost isn't a con, because I totally couldn't imagine how else they could have ended it. I can see why the book was ended this way. It totally makes sense to the character, it makes sense to the narrative, it makes sense to the direction. It just left me feeling like I wanted more, which would have been fine if there were more books. But sadly, and yet again, something I didn't know until after I'd read this, but Sylvia Plath killed herself 1 month after this book was published by putting her head in an oven. And that's just heartbreaking. And it just puts this book into so much more perspective once you know that. Throughout the novel, we see our protagonist, Esther, who is so smart and so self-aware, really struggling to try to transform herself. And this is often indicated through the use of blood in the book. So at one point, Esther buys some books, and I actually can't find the page that this one's on, so I'm just going to read it off the screen. So, Only My Case Was Incurable. I had bought a few paperbacks on abnormal psychology at the drugstore and compared my symptoms with the symptoms in the book. And sure enough, my symptoms tallied with the most hopeless of cases. Even in this passage, we see the concept of the bell jar, where Esther is attempting to find help for herself, but she's doing it in the most isolated and alienated way possible, by reading to herself and stewing in the mess of her mind over all that is wrong with her. This character's self-critique and the author's real-life struggles with mental health issues are what make this book so utterly believable. While I definitely wouldn't recommend this book to anyone that is suffering from any mental health issues or feeling depression at all, and while I can totally understand While some people may absolutely hate this book and find it too dull and too depressing, for those wanting a looking glass into the minds of clinical depression, this is a must read. And if you're still totally not sure if this is something that you want to read or not, I would actually suggest going and reading one of Sylvia's poems. I've linked to one down below, which is a famous one of hers called Daddy, and just seeing if you like that or are interested in that, because that might tell you if you want to go further. So I've actually decided that I want to do a film comparison to any of the books in my top 100 that do have an adaptation. Now, there is a film adaptation of The Bell Jar starring Marilyn Hassett from 1979. But this movie was really bad. Really, it wasn't received well at the time either, apparently. I just watched it maybe an hour ago, and I felt like they were trying to force this emotional journey for Esther. Esther's story is all in her head, and because it's so much about what she's thinking, it just doesn't seem to adapt well to film because you don't really understand her motivations. There are some things done in this film that totally don't resonate well with the book and go against the book, especially her dealings with Buddy, who is the boyfriend. In this movie adaptation, they kind of turn Esther into this character who's rocking back and forward, wailing in an armchair. And breaking pencils as she's scribbling manically in the back of a lecture hall. And it doesn't fit with her character. It just doesn't feel like the Esther on the pages. Now, apparently there is meant to be a new version coming out. It's meant to be a limited series. It was meant to be directed by Kirsten Dunst and starring Dakota Fanning as Esther. I'm not sure what's happening because of all the COVID stuff, if it's being put on the back burner a little bit, but we'll see if the new version is any better. And if it does come out, I will definitely review it. But honestly, I don't see how you can turn this book into a movie effectively. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. It wasn't a hard read. I didn't find it as depressing as a lot of people apparently found it, which I'm not sure what that says about me, but so be it. The book, The Bell Jar, is beautiful. It's so poignant. It is such a real and at times kind of understated view of mental health. I'd give it a 3.5 out of 5 star rating. Until next time.